that there, the arrival, I imagine, of the Spanish Prime Minister. We are, of course, bringing you live visuals from the Union buildings, and we'll be watching that very closely, where he has been traveling across the continent, having spent some time with the King and President as well, arriving now, meeting with our very own President. Big talks around trade relations between Spain and South Africa on the table.
Our colleagues Sophie, Mokoena and Natasha Phiri are there live. Let's hear what they have to say.
Well, very good morning to you, Desiree and Naledi. Indeed, there we see visuals, I'm not so sure if you can see them, of the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, and of course he is accompanied by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, proceedings somewhat had to change because of the rain, and we've had to resort to Plan B. There you see the two leaders walking there, and of course I'm also joined by Ms. Sophie, who is our foreign news editor. Of course, trade relations between the two countries, like you said, have increased over the past 2 years, increasing from 14 million to 28. And there you have President Cyril Ramaphosa and just greeting various ministers, introducing the Prime Minister to the various delegation of South African ministers. Of course, there is shaking the hand of Minister Natasha. And let me just bring in Sophie Mokoena on this conversation. Trade between the two countries have quadrupled over 2 years. I mean, what is the significance of this?
Well, I think you earlier on touched on the two leaders meeting, Ndatekwe and Natasha. As you know, that Spain has been assisting South Africa in terms of moving to the renewable energy. And I think that issue of supply of energy will be high on the agenda. You know, the European countries are also trying to get our coal so that they can be able to have a power supply, because they have challenges with Northern Hemisphere now approaching winter. They are struggling because they can't get supply from Russia due to the war in Ukraine. You saw Minister of Agriculture, Togo Didiza there. It is all about food security. You know that the war in Ukraine has also affected food security. And of course, as you pointed out, the Minister of Trade and Industry, Patel, on issues related to trade and industry. And I think he will lead the discussions this afternoon when the two leaders meet business people.
I like the fact that you talk about the South Africa, the Ukraine war. What impact does this have, especially on countries like Spain, in terms of oil and agriculture as well?
Well, you know that Spain has just hosted the NATO summit. That was in June, where the issue of the war in Ukraine was discussed in terms of military support to Ukraine. But also, as the member of the European Union, they have been grappling with issues of food supply and energy supply. So different ministers at the European Union level, for example, the ministers of energy, the ministers of trade and investment, have been meeting in Brussels to discuss how they can deal with this issue. Now, the new thing about Spain is that Spain has decided to strengthen its relations with Africa. The leader has taken a different approach. He wants to work with Africa, and therefore Africa has got lots and lots of resources, and therefore they are looking at Africa to assist them, particularly at this critical time. And that is why he was also in Kenya, where he met the president of Kenya, William Ruto, trying to strengthen the relations with East Africa. And now he is in the tip of the continent, the southern tip of the continent, South Africa. And even here, it's all about trade, but also peace and security around the world. I spoke to the minister earlier on. He really spoke about this issue.
And of course, Spain has prioritized, talking about Africa, Spain has prioritized 3 countries in Africa: Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia. I also want you to talk about, you just spoke to the minister, Pando, earlier on. Let's talk about security in the Sahel region.
Yes, you know that the Sahel region, it is one of the regions on the continent that is experiencing political and security instability. Quite a number of groups there, the insurgents operating there. The problem there is the issue of political challenges, but also the issue of drought. And you know, with climate change, the impact thereof, when you have drought, people move around. And as they move, then they clash because they are fighting for greener pastures and also for space. And therefore, the insurgents are taking advantage of that kind of challenge in the Sahel region. And Spain, France, and other European countries have been assisting to stabilize West Africa and Sahel region. But the president of Spain is now reconsidering that position. He wants to give Africa a chance to resolve its own challenges, including the thorny issue of the Western Sahara. You know, Spain was a former colony, and therefore they have decided to listen to African countries who are saying that part of Western Sahara that is still occupied must be liberated. And therefore, it looks like even that is going to be on the agenda. That's what the minister spoke about, even referring to the alert yesterday from the U.S. Embassy saying that you can't ignore what's happening in the Sahel region, in West Africa, and now in Cabo Delgado. South Africa is not immune, or it's not, we are not an island.
Yeah.
We can also be affected.
You actually answered my next question. But Sophie, let's also look at the fact that, in terms of Spain is probably the 5th largest economy in Europe and the 14th largest in the continent. What lessons can we take as South Africans? I mean, we struggle with a high unemployment rate. We've got the triple challenges as well that also plague our country. What can we learn from them?
Well, I think the issue of how we can deal with building a strong economy, there's a lot that we can learn, particularly the economy that is supported by tourism. And then you also have the issue of energy, as I pointed out. Already they are assisting South Africa in terms of dealing with the current electricity crisis that we have. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. I mean, this is part of the European Union, and it's quite important for South Africa to have relations with these countries. However, what is critical is that as we strengthen relations with all these countries around the world, our autonomy and independence of South Africa must be protected at all times. In other words, South Africa can still take its own decisions. When we talk about Ukraine, we know that in terms of Ukraine, Spain will be part of the European Union supporting Ukraine and condemning Russia. But South Africa has taken a different position. They want peace, and therefore they feel both parties must be brought to the negotiating table so that you can find peace as part of the South African policy that is anchored around maintaining peace in the world.
And also this visit comes at the backdrop of, our president being criticized by former presidents. But I mean, just listening to various analysts have said that this is nothing new. That also happened during the Thabo Mbeki era, where former president or the late president Nelson Mandela also criticized former president Thabo Mbeki.
You don't even have to have someone to tell you about this thing. When you just Google, you'll see that it has happened before. I mean, when the ANC people talk about the watershed moment, the Morogoro conference, where O.R. Tambo was heavily criticized and Chris Hani very vocal. And however, they did find one another. It is not new. Yes, many leaders would prefer that they discuss this behind closed doors, but there are times where you really have to speak, particularly when you see the whole country complaining, because if you don't say something, the country will lose hope in the leadership. But when you speak, however, you have to be careful what you say and how you put your criticism, because, for example, if you make unfounded allegations that you can't back up, people can go to court. You have to have evidence to back up what you are saying. But I think people being critical, it's not a sin as long as it's done in a form of a very cordial manner with the aim of strengthening and correcting what is wrong. Because, Natasha, you are a political reporter. The South Africans are complaining about many things. And the president, at times, he can't come there and say some of the stuff because he has to be seen as pulling the nation together, but also protecting everybody. But those who are not in government can assist by pointing out at the weaknesses, and those in the executives must not take this personal, but rather correct. And for now, my observation is that President Ramaphosa has tried to manage this thing by not going out and responding, but rather looking at how do you address this? Because you'd recall that he did criticize President Jacob Zuma when he did that cabinet reshuffle that led to the country experiencing economic crisis, or the rand taking a knock. And we've seen it. Madiba did that with Mbeki. Yes, it was in the NEC, and when he couldn't find joy in the NEC, he went out. I mean, I was covering Mandela. I know those incidents. So there has been moments like that. I mean, the former president or deputy president of the ANC, Kgalema Motlanthe, when he spoke about the ANC and its performance, saying perhaps ANC must lose elections, it was almost like a wake-up call. So I think when you are a leader, you must accept criticism, because then you'll strengthen where there are weaknesses. And behind the scenes, yes, you can be robust at the NEC and the NWC, but yeah, as a leader, at the end of the day, President Ramaphosa is a leader. He can't be seen as being factional or being weak where he can't even stand criticism. And for now, in terms of criticism or critics, he has been able to manage that. It might be hurting, but he has been able to show a brave face. You just saw him now walking. Tomorrow he's in Lesotho at the inauguration.
And of course you'll be there.
He's in KwaZulu-Natal. So he's continuing with work. It is tough, but yeah.
Ms. Sophie, just briefly before we cross back to the ladies in the studio, what happens from now on? I know that they will be behind closed doors signing MOUs, and then will they be briefing members of the media, because the program has changed due to the weather today?
Yes, I think we will still have that briefing where they are going to tell us what transpired during the talks. And I think high on the agenda will be trade and issues, or global issues, security and politics. And therefore we'll be able perhaps to pose questions, particularly on issues related to the threat yesterday from the U.S. Embassy, but also from the President of Spain. Maybe he can tell us what is Spain doing in terms of the Africans, particularly young people who are perishing in the Mediterranean seas. We saw what happened in Morocco in June. So I think there's a lot to discuss, and media also would want some answers.